Very much for coming. I know this is kind of the worst point in the semester to be doing this, so I really appreciate it. It felt more embarrassing to have my vocational bio read out loud than I thought it would, so thank you for that. But yeah, so I'm really excited to talk to you all about this today. I was especially nervous for this just because, for our continuum talks, we're supposed to talk about our research, but also how our research is connected to like our trajectory and our faith and our, journey as researchers and teachers. So this topic is really close to my heart and my own experience. So it has an added dimension that typical academic talks don't. But okay, so I will just dive in. So first, I really appreciated thinking about giving this talk and being able to kind of think through how I would draw a through line between my experiences in college and grad school and now at Hope. So I went to the University of Notre Dame for undergrad and grad school, and I ended up there somewhat randomly. My family was very much not into academic things at all. My parents were definitely like constantly telling me you should just kind of chill out, like maybe skip class every once in a while. You really shouldn't be as into this as you are. So I was very self-motivated on that front, and ended up going to Notre Dame largely because of their sports program. So I was very into academics in high school, but actually my main thing was sports. So ran cross country and track, soccer, basketball, was super into that, was like most athletic in my high school. And it was a small high school, so that's not that impressive, but that was the main draw there. But they also had a really great honors program that was really formative for me, and then their campus ministry was also wonderful. So when I went to college, I initially started as a pre-med major, kind of for typical reasons. I didn't know what I wanted to do, and the line I heard was like, well, you're smart and you want to help people, so be pre-med. So I was pre-med. What I really wanted to do was actually studio art. So when I applied to colleges, I applied with my like art portfolio and stuff, and that was a really big thing for me. And then a couple of semesters into college, I realized I did not want to be a pre-med major, and instead was really taken by my philosophy and theology classes. So my parents were a little sad to go from having a future doctor to having a future philosopher theologian, but they came around, and so I ended up double majoring in philosophy and theology, and I often say I have like a pseudo art major as well, because I went through all the studio art classes, just didn't take a couple history of art classes that were required to kind of put the cherry on top of that. But so I was really drawn first by a philosophy of religion course that I took, because in that class, I saw people dealing with and kind of grappling with these questions that I had often wrestled with in a very rigorous and compelling way. So for example, a big one is the problem of evil, right? So how can it be that God is all-knowing, all-good, and all-powerful, and yet we also see the extent of suffering and evil that we do in the world? Like, how do those two things go together? So was really into philosophy of religion, and also got very into philosophy of science, or history of philosophy of science, weirdly. So I was a research assistant for my professor, Catherine Brading, and that was her area of study. And through working with her, I became really obsessed with this like small pocket of history in which Kepler and Tycho Brahe, the astronomers, were working, and kind of like revolutionizing our understanding of the solar system. It's really fascinating because the reason I found them so compelling was for them, their view of the universe was very much like scientific, bound up with theological concerns, bound up with aesthetic concerns too. So for example, like when Kepler would put out pamphlets about his newest, discoveries, the first 75% of the pamphlet was like, here are the theological implications of this finding. And then the last 25% were like, here's my scientific methodology. So I was just really drawn to this way of viewing the world because it drew together kind of theological interests and aesthetic interests and philosophical interests. So in working with this professor, I also got to do really cool things at the Digital Visualization Theater at Notre Dame, which is kind of like a planetarium. But it was really cool just working with like physics and computer science grad students to make these sort of immersive experiences for students to sort of simulate what it was like to use some of these old school astronomical instruments and make observations. So all of this is kind of connected in various ways to what I'm doing right now. But additionally, I fell in love with philosophy because it really enabled you to be interdisciplinary. So if you can't tell, I was definitely the kind of student who wanted to major in like 7 different things. And I really love that philosophy enabled me to kind of dig my hands into multiple different disciplines. So yeah, and then on to grad school. While I really loved philosophy in undergrad, I didn't really start thinking about grad school until pretty late in the game, and even in the very end was super torn between philosophy grad school and going into church ministry full-time, because I was very into that in college, and ultimately decided to go the grad school route partially because it would be easier to shift from grad school to ministry than it would be to go the opposite direction later. And then was ultimately deciding between like 3 of the most different places. So Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana, UCLA in Los Angeles, and CUNY in New York City. So ended up picking Notre Dame. For some reasons, that was a good choice. But yeah, it worked out well in some ways. So while I was at Notre Dame, the history of philosophy of science interest kind of was put on the back burner, as was kind of my interest in philosophy of art and aesthetics. And I ended up focusing mostly on work in philosophy of mind and cognitive science, and then also a bit of philosophy of religion as well. So with philosophy of mind and cognitive science, what I ended up writing my dissertation on and what's kind of informed a lot of the work I'm still doing now is on these 3 theories within cognitive science, and really roughly what they're about are like the ways in which our mind and body are much more directly and robustly connected to each other. And then predictive processing is roughly about how our experiences of the world are actually much more due to what we bring to the table, so to speak, as opposed to what's just given to us out there in the world. So an example of this is, a really simple example of this is like my beliefs and past experiences of apples as red actually penetrates and makes me perceptually see apples as more red than they are, right? So there's various ways in which this happens or can happen at multiple levels of our perception and understanding. So I was really fascinated by this and basically worked on these topics, thinking through their philosophical implications and kind of how to understand them philosophically. And yeah, also while I was in grad school, a couple other things that were really formative for me was some of the teaching that I did. So I taught classes at Notre Dame, and I also taught a community engaged course. So it was on religion, identity, and social justice. And it was really interesting because I was able to do like experiential learning stuff with students and kind of pairing them up with community organizations. So that was really formative for me. And then I also taught in a prison education program and then a course at the South Bend Center for the Homeless. And so these were really important to me for a lot of reasons, one of them being one of the perpetual kind of struggles or tensions I've had with being a philosopher is like fascination with philosophical work, thinking it's really important work, and yet there are so many practical concerns and needs out there in the world that it would always be good to have more people addressing those. So I really enjoyed teaching these classes because, so I taught like an ethics course and an intro to philosophy course and a course kind of on identity and the self. And the students in these courses really saw the value in the philosophy we were going through and value in the humanities more generally. And after the prison course, students would come up to me, and this wasn't just about my course, but the program more generally, but they would say things like, my body is in prison, but I feel like my mind is free after going through this. Just talking about how much studying philosophy informed their understanding of themselves and the world. So it was just really cool to see ways in which like teaching and academia was kind of intersecting with these practical concerns and really found to be valuable by these people. And then additionally, I was really into a lot of ministry things when I was in grad school, so I was really heavily involved in a church plant, and then also kind of kids ministry and adolescent ministry. Additionally, mental disorder stuff came up a lot in grad school, which is obviously very relevant to this project. But looking back on my life up to this point, I can definitely see that at many points I've experienced symptoms of mental disorder, sometimes fairly severely, but up until that point, I didn't recognize them as that. My mindset, the mindset of many people around me, was like, well, this must be what everyone experiences, so I just need to try harder. And after the first year or so in grad school, that was no longer possible. So I ended up going in to talk to somebody, got diagnosed, got put on some medication. I think I tried 13 different medications before I found some that worked for me, which was a terrible experience. But once I found medication that worked for me, it was a game changer. And so my personal experiences, along with the fact that many, especially of the teens that I was working with, mental disorder and kind of how that was received or not received by their families and churches was a huge thing. And also that was a point where my family suddenly decided to reveal to me our past family history of mental disorder. So all of these things really kind of motivated this project I'm going to talk about. So after grad school, I came to Hope. I was really thankful for this job, really excited about it. Lots of things I enjoy about it. So with teaching, I love that I could do some interdisciplinary teaching and teaching some of these courses that are like very relevant and very connected to my research interests. And I also was able to teach a course in the Calvin Prison Initiative, and also will be teaching one in the Hope Western Prison Initiative. And then additionally, I've gotten plugged into like different ministry community organizations. So NAMI, which is like the largest grassroots organization addressing mental illness, who I'm working with on this research project, and then lots of local churches as well. So when I first came to Hope, I was kind of following along with the research I had done previously, and then sort of through a weird combination of events involving like a last-minute 9-house application with a student, we pitched this like mental disorder and religion project, and it ended up being really wonderful and kind of started me off on this project. So it's been really great because as a part of this stuff, I've been able to work with a lot of students, which has been wonderful, and I really do view them as like student research collaborators rather than assistants, because as this is really interdisciplinary work, many of them were coming to it with like different disciplinary backgrounds and different kind of capacities and expertise that was just really wonderful to have that kind of back and forth with them while working with them on these projects. And I've also been able to get into a fair bit of empirical work and getting some grant support for what I've been doing, which has also been exciting and completely new to me as a philosopher. We didn't do any of that in grad school. I was largely discouraged from doing those kinds of things in grad school. So now I'm going to talk a bit more in depth about the research project after I go through this slide. Okay, so one last thing before getting into this research project. I liked thinking about this presentation and just trying to think about what some potential through lines are between a lot of my different academic interests, because I think they are there. So one thing is I've always been really interested in like porous boundaries between normal reality and stuff that seems to lie on the other side, right? So fantasy, dreams, hallucinations, simulations, and also notably like often symptoms of mental disorder and religious experiences. It seems like when we're experiencing those kinds of things, something different is going on than what we experience in our day-to-day lives. And I've just been really interested in the philosophical ways of understanding those experiences, partially because I think I have them a lot. I'm somebody who's like very high in absorption. I tend to get super absorbed into lots of these kinds of things. And then kind of going off of that, as I was talking about with some of those theories in cognitive science that are largely looking at what we bring to the table in terms of our beliefs and our expectations and how those actually like form our experiences of the world, not just help us interpret them. I've been really interested in that, and specifically like the kinds of frameworks we use for doing that, the frameworks we use for meaning making, making sense of the world. So in this research project having to do with mental disorder and religious engagement, theories of what the mind is, what the person is, what mental disorder is, all of those play a really important role, not just in how people understand their mind and their mental disorder, et cetera, but also in how they experience them. So these frameworks for meaning making are just really important to understand more about and how they're affecting us. And they kind of manifest in various ways and are informed by various sources, but some of the big ones are like narratives. Also, metaphors can play a big role in kind of structuring how we understand things, right? So one example of this is, think about if you kind of thought of your faith in terms of the metaphor, like your faith is like a wall to kind of build and fortify, versus your faith is like a garden to grow and cultivate. You can see how, if you're operating with those two different frameworks, you will interpret experiences very differently, right? So you will interpret a setback really differently. You might think of it as something that's like weakening the foundations of your faith, right? Or you might see it as a kind of pruning that's conducive to further growth, right? So lots of ways in which these frameworks are affecting us, often in ways we're kind of unconscious of. So a lot of what I've been doing is kind of looking into raising these frameworks more to the surface and looking at their effects. Okay, so now, this project, largely I'm interested in both looking at how people experience interactions between their mental disorder and religious engagement, and also how they understand these interactions. And I'm interested in both and have studied both positive and negative interactions between the two, but I'm especially interested in potentially positive effects of mental disorder on religious engagement, because by and large, that's the most underexplored philosophically, empirically, for some pretty good reasons. But so I was really interested in that. Like, for example, people saying things like, my experience of hopelessness as a result of my depression increased my sense of God's presence, which is something we heard a lot on our studies. And then additionally, I was really interested in basically getting further information about which symptoms might be involved in these interactions, which sort of external factors might be involved in these interactions, and which components. So by religious engagement, this is kind of a catch-all term I'm using to refer to religious beliefs, religious experiences, and religious practices. So in my first study, basically, it was really exploratory, and I probably won't go through all these methodological details because they're kind of boring, but it was very exploratory because, like I said, there wasn't a whole lot of research on this topic, and I just kind of wanted to cast a wide net and see if there would be any interesting patterns that would come back, and then ideally kind of dig into those with more specificity later. It was qualitative, so we had participants fill out a really extensive questionnaire, and then with many of them did extensive follow-up interviews that largely were just inviting them to expand on the answers they had given to our questions on the questionnaire. We had 150 questionnaire participants, and about a third of those participated in interviews with us, and they were gathered through like the NAMI national listserv, and then also some local communities and churches. And so while we didn't have specific hypotheses for this study, we had some key questions. So one was whether participants do report experiencing a positive impact of their mental disorder on their religious engagement. If so, which specific benefits did they report or cite most often? And then, like I mentioned, which symptoms are most often involved, which external factors, and which components of religious engagement are most often positively impacted. So we found a lot of things, and this is just kind of a snapshot, but in terms of the positive interaction findings, overall, 44% of our participants reported mostly or somewhat positive effects of their mental disorder on their religious life, 23% equally positive and negative. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the negative interaction stuff later. But one thing to note about this is our participants were adamant that this does not mean they thought their mental disorder was positive. This does not mean they thought God gave them their mental disorder. This does not mean they thought these benefits in any way outweighed the suffering they had experienced as a result of their mental disorder. And yet, in the midst of the suffering they had experienced, they were citing these really profound benefits that they had experienced as well. So the symptoms that were cited most often by participants as like being involved in these positive effects on their religious engagement were a sense of loss and hopelessness, which I thought was really interesting that that was the one most often cited as having a positive effect. Experiences of depression, anxiety, fear and or worries, and also guilt. And then the external factors cited most often as like playing a role in enabling this kind of positive effect were tied for first place, prayer and professional therapy, and then also religious friends and community and reading scripture. So a couple things to note about both of these findings. These don't justify claims about the frequency of the involvement of these symptoms or external factors over other symptoms or external factors. So for example, in the list of symptoms they were presented with, there was hallucinations. People much more often experience depression than experience hallucinations. So it could be that whenever people experience hallucinations, it's much more likely to have this positive effect, but less people experience that symptom overall, right? So basically, one of the reasons why these symptoms might have been picked is because they're just more frequently experienced, if that makes sense. So even though you can't justify comparative claims, I think these findings are still really interesting as far as like where to look further in terms of these symptoms and then external factors. And then on the benefits front, so this is where we found what I think is some of the most interesting information. So we found a lot of benefits that people cited, and I grouped them into these three groups. The groups overlap with each other. They're not as precise as I would like as a philosopher, but they seem to make the most sense. So first, kind of motivational benefits. People often cited their mental disorder, causing them to increase their engagement in religious practices, increase their engagement with community, and increase their reliance on God. And I'm going to go through a couple of quotes in a bit. On kind of the affective or experiential front, people reported their mental disorder increasing their sense of purpose, increasing their sense of God's presence, and increasing their sense of empathy. And increases in sense of empathy are obviously not specifically religious, and that's a finding that's well replicated in psychological research on this front. So many studies kind of confirming that experiences of mental disorder and suffering more generally increase people's sense of empathy. And then kind of epistemological benefits or benefits having to do with people's beliefs. People reported an increase in their understanding of Scripture, an increase in their understanding and belief in God, an increase in their understanding of what I'm calling like the Christian promise, which is a term from a participant, or the goal of faith. And that will make more sense when I go through these quotes. So these are some quotes from participants. I'm not going to read through them all, just the highlighted ones, but they're very representative of a lot of the quotes that we got. So in explaining how their mental disorder increased their engagement in religious practices, one participant, who I think, given the answer, was a philosopher, said, "My anxiety seems to prompt me to be scrupulous and establish habits of prayer, repentance, etc. Given that I think most of us today are prone to go about our lives thinking we are generally good and there is no need for mercy and reparations, I think that being what feels like a bit scrupulous lends me to arrive at the virtuous mean. I think today's world pulls me to laziness and thinking I am better than I am, and my anxiety helps me overshoot the mean, hopefully arriving at some sort of appropriate middle ground." Now, to be clear, I'm not endorsing this. I'm just saying this is what the participant reported as far as how their mental disorder, they thought, positively affected their faith. Then on the experiential front, so a couple participant quotes. One said, "I can think of at least one season in which feeling hopeless prompted me to turn to God. And again, I would say that some of my most meaningful encounters with God happened when I was depressed, lost, hopeless." And another participant, "I would experience intense euphoria and feel close to God when I was hypomanic. I believe the racing thoughts and hyperactivity was because I was living life the way God had planned and he was sending me messages." Again, not endorsing, just reporting these experiences. And then finally on like the epistemological front, I find these super fascinating, and this is something I'm kind of working on more now. So people reporting their experience of mental disorder had increased their understanding of like the Christian promise or the goal of faith. So one participant said, before their experience with mental disorder, "I would have probably said, oh, God wants us to be healthy, happy, and that's kind of the most important thing. But I think now, not that he wants us to be miserable, I'm not saying that at all, but I see it so differently, and that the most work he's done in my life is through my suffering, and that my happiness is not the biggest goal on earth by any means, and that the way he's changed me, the way he's brought me into deeper relationship with him, has been through my suffering. And then another participant said, my experience of mental disorder clarified for me what the Christian promise really is. It is not that things will work out for you here. Your entire life might be horrible. The promise, rather, is that for it to be redeemed eventually, and perhaps for some moderate divine consolation along the way, but even that is not a guarantee. I should say not a guarantee. But yeah, so these participants and kind of a lot of participants who reported beneficial effects on their belief, the general pattern was they had these beliefs beforehand about God, about faith, about Christianity. Then they experienced mental disorder, and it really challenged these previous beliefs that they held. And for these participants, they felt like they ended up coming to a better understanding of these concepts and a deeper faith in God. But also, for some participants, it did not have that effect. It undermined their faith in God. It undermined their sense of his presence. So, speaking of that, negative interaction findings. I'm going to spend less time on this, but I think there are still really interesting things here. So, again, with this question of overall impact, 24.5% said mostly or somewhat negative effects of their mental disorder on their religious and or spiritual life. The symptoms cited most often, far and away, guilt was the winner, then fear and worry, sense of loss and hopelessness, and then again, far and away, the external factors cited most often as basically like mediating this negative interaction between mental disorder and religion was Christian views of mental health. Came up over and over and over again in what they selected from the list in all of our interviews, and so that's something I'm kind of working on with this second study. And then as far as specific negative effects, kind of looking at these same categories, so motivational, isolation from others, isolation from God, sense of abandonment, fear of judgment, feelings of responsibility, fatigue, and then on the epistemological kind of belief-oriented front, over-spiritualization of mental disorder. So viewing mental disorder themselves and those around them, viewing mental disorder as something that primarily had a spiritual cause and a spiritual treatment. So, you have depression because you don't pray enough. This was very harmful to participants and is fairly prevalent and, very misleading. So over-spiritualization of mental disorder, a lot of people encountered this. And then, this is so interesting, kind of like the flip side of the Christian promise stuff I was just talking about, participants who experienced these negative interactions noted that one thing that really played a role here were their unfulfilled expectations. So they thought or were told that their faith, their religious practices would protect them from mental disorder or diminish their suffering from mental disorder, and it didn't. And it was specifically that gap, those like unfulfilled expectations that did a lot of harm for them in basically exacerbating the suffering they were experiencing. So basically, one takeaway from these negative findings is Christian views of mental disorder are really important. And again, not just for how people are understanding mental disorder, but for how they experience them. Okay, so these are a couple quotes just kind of expressing Christian views of mental health that people found harmful. I'll just read through these quickly. So one participant said, I've often been met with, I haven't had enough faith or I would have been healed, whether I have unconfessed sin or I haven't prayed enough. And it's really, really been a challenge to kind of get past the hurt of that. Not everybody by any means, but kind of that a lot of people in the church have seen me as somebody to be fixed instead of just being someone to care for or to help or just to welcome in. And then an interesting kind of different take on this front was one participant who had experienced psychosis fairly often, so delusions and hallucinations, said, part of the reason that I lost my faith is because of what felt to me like hypocrisy in the church regarding my illness. So that I felt like, on the one hand, you believe in prophecy, you believe there's this other world, you believe all these things, But then when somebody experiences them, you say, oh, no, 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 not like that. This is too far. That's not what we think. To me, it felt like there was no place for anything outside of a very sedate kind of Christianity, a sedate version of Christianity. So two different ways in which people found the reception and view of their mental disorder in the church very harmful. So then, and this will be much briefer, but I ran a second study kind of motivated by some of the findings in the first study. So basically motivated by this sharp divergence we saw between some participants who said, yes, I've experienced positive effects of my mental disorder on my religion. I'm going to tell you about it. Some participants who said no, and then a subset of these participants who went further to say things like, I don't know what you're talking about. You're asking about positive effects of mental disorder on religion. I don't know what that means. One participant emailed us afterwards to say, I just want to let you know, I think you have a typo on the entire first half of your questionnaire because you're asking about positive effects of mental disorder on religion. Obviously, that doesn't make any sense, and so you should look into that. And then plenty of participants who said some version of like, this is the first time I've ever thought about this question. This is the first time I've ever entertained it as a possibility that my mental disorder might have positive effects on my religion. So to be clear, there are some participants, some people who might never experience positive effects of their mental disorder on their religion, and that's nothing to do with them. That's nothing to do with failures on their front. And it might very well not be due to anything at the level of their understanding. But for some of these participants who made these statements, to me it really indicated a lack of conceptual space, like a lack of ability to even imagine this as a possibility. And this is really important for experiencing some of those positive effects. So, it's important that the person believes or is at least open to the potential for these kinds of experiences to be transformative or to be positive in order for it to be positive. So again, this is an instance where our beliefs about things, our underlying theories about things play a really important role in kind of enabling or cutting us off to certain sorts of experiences. So in the second study, again, kind of boring stuff, but in the second study, I basically decided to present participants with extended narratives or stories of participants in the first study that were appropriately anonymized and all that. But so I would take all of Jane's responses on the questionnaire and in our interviews, was looking for certain things and kind of wove them together into a coherent narrative. And I didn't add anything to the narratives. And basically had participants read through and engage with 5 of these narratives, asked them a set of questions before, asked them the same set of questions afterwards, looked if there were any interesting differences between their answers on that front. And basically, I'll just kind of skip ahead because I'm talking about the hypotheses. So basically, one thing we were looking at is whether people seem to experience some of the same benefits that we found in the first study. So basically, we asked them about these things along with other things on the list and said, okay, tell us whether as a result of your mental disorder, you experienced an increase in these things, decrease in these things, have an experience, neutral, mixed, etc. So this is the percent of participants who reported an increase in these things. So these are obviously the same benefits from the first study. And again, you can see sense of empathy is like at the top. And then these things, there were some interesting correlations between people citing these benefits and the extent to which they closely identified with their religion, that's what this scale is about, or closely identified with their mental disorder. And then the 3 other things we were kind of looking at were whether or not, as a result of reading through these stories, people would increase the extent to which they positively identified with their mental disorder or increase the extent to which they positively identified with their religion. We were also looking at their view of mental disorder and whether or not they were open to both biological and spiritual dimensions of their mental disorder. And then lastly, we were looking for whether or not some of these changes, these significant changes, were correlated with kind of like how engaged they were in the narratives. So the interesting takeaway from this is that, yes, people did experience basically increases in how positively they were identifying with their religion, as well as their mental disorder. And specifically, we saw the biggest change in their basically agreement or disagreement with these statements. So we saw the most significant change in participants' disagreement with this statement, "I wonder whether God has abandoned me." So, potentially, as a result of engaging with these narratives, participants feeling less like God had abandoned them in the midst of their experience with mental disorder. And then looking at the questions, specifically picking up on their identification with their mental disorder, we saw the most change in people increasing in agreement with, "I have found benefits to having mental health symptoms," and increasing disagreement with the statements, "Because of my mental disorder, I will never become the person I want to be," and "Because of my mental disorder, I don't pursue my dreams." So I think it's interesting to note that some of the biggest changes on this front were participants basically feeling less like their mental disorder was something that was actively restricting them or taking them away from their true sense of identity. Okay, so basically, as a result of some of the things we found, these are just kind of further thoughts on this front, but for the sake of time, I'm going to wrap it up. But I think it's really interesting to think about the advantages of narratives and how they play a really important role in kind of affecting how we view many things, including mental disorder. And luckily for us, Christianity is like chock full of narratives. We have various practices in liturgy already that involve people expressing their stories, sharing their testimonies. And so I think it's really powerful and something that I'm trying to focus on in what I'm working on this summer, basically like increasing the amount of first-person narratives, specifically addressing people's experiences with mental disorder in the Christian church as a way to kind of move the needle on some of these views about mental disorder. So just kind of a summary of what we found. So seems like many people, a significant number of people do experience positive effects of their mental disorder on religious engagement, but again, doesn't mean the mental disorder was positive. Got further information about like specific symptoms, external factors, components of religious engagement involved, and it does seem like engagement with these narratives seems to cause some positive changes in how people are understanding their mental disorder, religion, and like the relationship between them. Also, too, basically found that Christian views of mental disorder play an extremely important role and in many ways are often misleading and harmful. So right now I'm kind of working on some theoretical stuff, looking more into, basically views about mental disorder, how they're coming from views of the emotions and emotional stability within Protestant Christianity, running like an empirical study this summer, and then also doing some practical stuff in terms of like curriculum development with this basically initiative through NAMI that is addressing much more the intersection between mental disorder and faith. Creating online resources, and I've done some different like church presentations and workshops, and some of those are kind of coming down the pike this summer and fall as well. But thank you very much for listening, and I also want to thank all of my amazing students and the grant support I have received, and I'm excited to hear your questions and thoughts.
Okay, we do have time for questions. So a lot there. Who would like to begin? Oh, please.
Well, thank you. This is very interesting. And congratulations on getting the Towsley, so you can spend a lot more time on it, right?
Yeah.
If you hadn't told me you were a philosopher, I would have thought you were a social scientist with this presentation. So where does the philosophy come into it?
Yeah. So one thing I often tell many of the students in my philosophy classes who are psychologists or neuroscience students is a lot of the questions that brought them into psychology and neuroscience are actually philosophical questions. So what happens often is psychologists will do their psychological work and then they'll also do kind of less well-baked philosophy on top of it. And philosophers are guilty of this as well, doing philosophy that's completely not empirically informed. But basically there's philosophy kind of at all levels of this. One, thinking more about the theories of mental disorder or the mind that underlie these experiences, very philosophical, thinking through what these theories are, what their different components are. Also, there was a lot of philosophical work involved in like looking at background research, developing the different questionnaires and interviews, analyzing the results that we found, kind of making conceptual distinctions between different things. So there's probably much more I could say there, but yeah, I think there's kind of philosophy throughout all of this. And one thing I always try to emphasize is like oftentimes there's philosophy involved in all of these other disciplines. It's just not labeled as such.
Okay, I have a question, and that is, it's very interesting that strong reaction to the positive the idea that there would be positive implications of a mental disorder for your religiosity or for your faith. I'm especially interested in that in the sense that Brené Brown's concept of vulnerability in popular kind of circles is so prevalent right now. It would seem to me that there's some notion of vulnerability that maybe is okay or is not okay vis-a-vis that understanding. That I'm wondering your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about this, but I think in a lot of ways, so one reason why I find this mental disorder stuff so interesting is that work on other kinds of suffering is like many steps ahead. So like, for example, theology of physical and intellectual disability, many steps ahead. Psychological work looking at the positive effects of grief or other traumatic experiences, many steps ahead. And it's interesting because there does seem to be more resistance to the particular kinds of vulnerability or suffering that comes from mental disorder. And I think there are many reasons for this. One reason might be the capacities that mental disorder affects are like super central to our sense of identity. So mental disorder can affect your ability to trust your perceptual capacities with hallucinations. It can affect your ability to trust your own thought processes with delusions and irrational thought patterns. It can affect your emotional stability, right? So it impacts us in a deeper way, I think, that makes it more freaky sometimes to allow us to entertain the idea that there might be some positive things resulting from it. And for that reason, it's more difficult to make sense of sometimes. And finally, too, specifically why I think there are difficulties looking at this in a religious context is it's really hard to come up with a clear set of criteria to say when something is a hallucination and when it's a religious experience, and when something is a delusion and when it's a deeply held religious belief. And that's not to say religious experiences are hallucinations or vice versa, but more and more work seems to be revealing that there are shared underlying psychological mechanisms between the two, and that really freaks people out, and that freaks me out sometimes too. So I think there's lots of reasons why, specifically with mental disorder, there seems to be a lot of resistance.
You sound like you're doing Towsley research to me. Others? Yeah, Matt, hold on. Let me get to you.
Thanks, Kate. 2 questions. One of them's short and easy, so I'll just ask both of them. The use of the phrase mental disorder, is that just like a standard, everybody calls it that, or did you choose that phrase out of other options and why? And then the second, the more complex question, thinking about maybe intersections with philosophy of religion here, especially divine agency, models of divine agency. It was interesting to read some of the quotes. A lot of them seem to presume a certain account of divine agency. God is a kind of discrete actor, almost a kind of like an occasionalistic kind of like divine, God wants, God does, God leaves. That wasn't obviously the purpose of your study, but I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about sort of, rabbit trails towards philosophy of religion, especially around like God's agency, how God acts. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
So first question, mental disorder is kind of a standard term used, so that's in favor over mental illness. And you might have noticed, maybe you didn't, there's no reason to notice this, but on some of the statements I had up here, it had the phrase mental health symptoms instead of mental disorder. So throughout these studies, we were instructed to use the term mental health symptoms because it was less stigmatizing. So in various ways, that complicated things, and we tried to make clear to participants we were using this phrase, but we were really interested in like diagnosed mental disorder. But I understand why the term mental disorder might be more stigmatizing. So did use that term intentionally, and it's much more, it's basically the most frequently used in the literature I'm looking at. And then on the agency front, I think this is super interesting. So this is sort of what some of this is getting into. So there's a lot of interesting work, again, not on mental disorder, but on how people often integrate natural and supernatural understandings of like physical diseases. And it brings up a lot of these questions because there's lots of different ways you can integrate these things, right? One might be God starts the causal process off and then lets different biological processes run. Another is he's like intervening at each step along the way. So I'm really interested to find more about like how people are viewing these things, whether there are interesting correlations between the two. And one thing on this front too is I did briefly kind of ask participants about different metaphors for their faith and which ones they felt resonated most with them. And it was really interesting because there were some patterns connected with metaphors that were kind of more active versus those that were more passive. So like, for example, my faith is something to build and strengthen versus my faith is like an anchor or like a magnet that keeps pulling me back. So yes, I think there's a lot of really interesting things to explore here.
Okay, anybody else? Yeah, please.
Thank you so much. Very interesting. Thanks. So in relation to the supernatural, natural, I mean, maybe you said this, maybe you didn't, I'm not sure. Did you find that people with mental disorders are more likely to be open to the supernatural, or open to the demonic even, or think parts of the Christian faith that maybe, I'm kind of in a mainline denomination. We don't really talk about that kind of stuff, but, there are other denominations. Oh, yeah, I don't know, maybe that's why as well. But, there are other denominations that are more kind of invested in spiritual warfare, the whole exorcisms, that kind of thing. So have you found any relation in terms of mental disorder in that?
So we didn't ask any questions that would get at that, whether or not people with mental disorder were more open to religious beliefs, partially because the setup of our studies was participants had to self-report having a mental disorder and having had significant interaction with Christianity. So they could currently identify as Christian or they might not, but they've had some significant experience with it. So that in itself kind of shrunk our pool that would have been needed to kind of answer that sort of question. But it is the case that like with things like psychological measures of absorption, something I mentioned, like how absorbed you get into experiences, that's very strongly correlated with how likely people are to have mystical experiences they describe as religious, and also symptoms of mental disorder. So there are definitely some traits that seem really highly correlated with both religion and experiences of mental disorder. And like I mentioned, this work in cognitive science of religion, looking at like underlying psychological mechanisms, there does seem to be, lots of instances where something we would think of as like a stereotypical, religious experience seems to share a similar mechanism with a symptom of mental disorder. But again, there's a lot of philosophical work that needs to be put into figuring out like same mechanism doesn't mean the same thing. So.
Well, friends, I hope you've enjoyed this time. I know, Kate, I'm so thankful that you're doing this work. When you talk about things being far ahead, I'm thankful that you're being supported to do it, and I just hope you continue to do it. And this, well, can we all thank Dr. Finley again? And thank you for joining us on and at such a busy time and week. Take care.
Yeah, thanks a lot for coming.